What can we do in our rural communities? We can increase the use of telemedicine in rural communities. We can eliminate stigma through education and training, and that's why we're here. We can educate rural communities about the new 988 system. That's coming in 2022. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. We want to increase messaging around mental health and crisis service in our rural communities. We want to educate our primary care physicians in rural areas. We want to focus on protective strategies, connection, support via our church, clergy to increase peer support and a sense of belonging and self-worth. And now we're going to talk about some of the research findings we know, and Bart's going to take it away.
I'm going to get this mic turned back. Okay, that's on, right? Okay. So interestingly, we've only been in the past several decades that we have done research in suicide and suicide prevention. And when you compare that to other health diagnoses like heart disease, diabetes, we know we have been studying those much, much longer. So what we are looking at in research, we're looking at many critical areas, like what drives up risk, what amounts to effective suicide prevention, and we still have so much more to learn. This section will provide an overview of suicide prevention research, key research findings, and future goals of the field. I love research, being a nurse, so I hope that I can kind of impart some of that to you. So one of the questions that we ask is, why do people take their lives? And it's when we lose someone to suicide too, we kind of want to know that one single reason why they died. But this is one thing that I really hope you take from today. Through research, we've learned that there is no single cause for suicide. It's very complex. Suicide most often occurs when several stressors and health issues converge to create an experience of hopelessness and despair. Hopelessness and despair. Research has consistently shown that the large majority of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death. It may or may not have been recognized by themselves, by their loved ones. It may have not been diagnosed by their physician, their healthcare provider, and maybe not adequately treated. That said, research has also made clear that mental health conditions cannot be the whole story. The vast majority of people who have a mental health condition do not die by suicide. In addition to mental health conditions, there are many other factors that increase risk as well. We've learned that the brains of people who die by suicide differ from those that die from other causes of death. And it's specifically in areas of the structure of the brain and the function of the brain. And we really are looking at stress response and impulse control. We've also learned that the most people who are suicidal are ambivalent about taking their lives. Part of them wants to live, part of them wants to die. And so keep that visual of that scale in mind. Part of them wants to live, part of them wants to die. Research has informed key strategies in suicide prevention that involve engaging the part of the person who wants to stay alive and helping to create distance from the part of them that wants to die. So part of them wants to live and part of them wants to die. One way we do that is for the person to connect with reasons for living, and at the same time decreasing the visibility and the presence of things around them. One way we do that is for the person to connect to die. Early on, as a faith community nurse, I heard a presentation by a social worker about suicide, and she said that and she was a behavioral health counselor also. And she said many times people will say, I would never die by suicide because of my faith. And so she said the importance of engaging that faith piece is so important for many, many people. So again, it's great that you have invited us here today. Now we're going to look at the perspective of a suicidal person. And one of the many important things we have learned from research is that a crisis point has been reached. Again, think of that scale. That crisis point has been reached. For a suicidal person, they are experiencing unbearable pain. It might be physical pain, it might be emotional pain, it even could be spiritual pain, or a combination of all three of those. So for a moment, I'd like you to just close your eyes. Think about a time when maybe you experienced extreme, unbearable pain. Maybe it was physical pain, maybe emotional pain, maybe spiritual pain. At that moment, what were you experiencing, and would you have been able to give someone clear, accurate directions to your house? Probably not. The pain makes ordinary thinking nearly impossible. For a suicidal person, thinking becomes very constricted. It's just an intense tunnel vision where they can't see anything out here. And they can't see any options that might be available for them. Someone who considers suicide cannot foresee a time when that pain will be gone. Understanding the perspective of a suicidal person has also helped us learn that suicidal thinking is often temporary. It can come on very intensely, very quickly, but it can also disappear, maybe in minutes, maybe in hours, sometimes longer. But keeping a person safe and helping them feel supported can get them, can be very critical, and then getting them the help. Here's something else I want you to take from today. There is evidence that putting time and distance between an individual who is suicidal and the means to take their life can be a life-saving action. Time and distance. That's why it's so important we take steps when we know someone is struggling to keep them safe. So now we're going to look at who is at risk. Research has helped us determine those key factors. We're going to be looking at health, historical, and environmental factors. And then looking at kind of how they can all converge to put someone at high risk. So if you think about somebody who's at high risk for heart disease, they may have high blood pressure, they may have a family history of heart disease. That's the same thing for someone who's at risk for suicide. Maybe they have a mental health condition, maybe they have a family history of mental health conditions or suicide in their family. These main factors shown again are health, historical, and environmental. And we will look at those a little bit closer. We'll start with health factors, such as biological and psychological medical conditions. The most significant, which of course are mental health conditions. As we said before, most people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death. Depression is the most common mental health condition and the one that's most often associated with suicide. Bipolar disorder is also known to show a high risk, although that disorder is less common than depression. Because these conditions put a person at greater risk for suicide, detecting the presence of a mental health condition is critically important. The best way to be sure when you feel concerned or detect a possible change in yourself or in someone that is close to you is for the person at risk to seek a professional evaluation and effective treatment. That could be a parishioner of yours. Many people may not realize that their distress has actually become a health problem. providing information about how to access mental health care or a crisis number if their distress is high can be a solid step in helping them connect to the help that they will need. And we're going to give you more information about that a little bit later on. Mental health conditions are not the only health factors that are associated with suicide risk. Serious or chronic health problems like Parkinson's, diabetes, and the list can go on, can increase risk, especially when a person also has a mental health condition. Chronic pain and serious head injuries have also been found to increase suicide risk. The second type of risk factor that we're going to look at is historical factors, such as a family history of suicide, a family history of mental health conditions, or past trauma, such as sexual abuse or combat stress. It is so important that we pass on our family history. Historically, we have not talked about suicide or mental health conditions in a family. When someone dies by suicide, we will say, we will never ever talk about this again. But people need to know their family, just like they need to know their physical health factors, they need to know their mental health factors also. Research has also found that a history of childhood abuse can contribute to suicide risk. And while most people who attempt suicide do not go on to die by suicide, previous suicide attempts are also considered historical risk factors for suicide and put a person at increased risk. Let's move on to environmental factors. And this is the third type that we will look at. Often there are aspects of a person's environment that can contribute to the overall level of risk. So let's look at some of the most common ones. Having access to a way of killing oneself is referred to as access to lethal means. This may include drugs, firearms, a car, a bridge, and we'll be looking at those a little bit more in depth later on. Research has also shown that contagion, the exposure to another person's suicide, or to a graphic or a sensational accounts can put someone at risk for suicide. And that's one thing that AFSP is doing in educating how to report on suicide, how we talk about it after suicide. We are doing a fair amount of work in our schools too, and we've got lots of information about that at our resource table. Prolonged stress may include harassment, bullying, relationship problems, legal problems, and unemployment. Stressful life events, which can vary across a lifespan, can put a person at risk too, such things as divorces, legal problems, job loss. So, to better understand suicide risk, we are going to look at our next slide. And what you may see is a person who is suffering from maybe a single life event. That's the person on the left. And again, so many times we say, why did that person die? And it maybe brings us comfort to know, but many times we just talk about maybe what we are seeing on the outside, an environmental issue, maybe that job loss, maybe a breakup, maybe that they were being bullied. But maybe we don't know the whole story. And remember, there's usually no single cause. Maybe they were at a genetic risk for suicide. Maybe they had been experiencing depression or another mental health condition. Maybe they were experiencing prolonged stress, maybe at work, at school, maybe in a relationship. And then maybe they were not dealing with it effectively, maybe using alcohol or drugs. And maybe their mental health condition hadn't been adequately treated. So it's very, very complex. And then we are going to look to what we are doing in the future in the field and how important research is. We're looking at biomarkers. Is there something testable in the blood, like there is for other health conditions, that might show that a person might be at risk? We're looking at different clinical treatment. What works best? what therapies are best, what medications are best. How can we, as a society, look at prevention and what prevention efforts work the best? And so we've got so much more to learn in research, but we're doing it with the help of all of you. So now we're going to look at seniors and suicide as a specific, population that you are serving in your congregation, and that's why we felt it was important. And Sam's going to take it over from here.
Again, just to reference the blue bags, there's also a brochure in the blue bags about suicide prevention within the senior community. Make sure you take a look at that, as well as, again, if you need extra examples, you can take more that's on the back table. Now we're going to move on in this section. We're going to talk for a few minutes specifically about what research has shown us about suicide and suicide risk among the population of special interest. And of course, in this area, we're talking about people ages 65 and older. Although suicide rates are highest among Americans ages 52 to 59 years old, the rate among Americans 65 and older are still higher than the national average. The CDC reports that in 2019, the suicide rate for Americans of all ages was 13.93 per 100,000. For individuals 65 and older, the rate was 16.98 per 100,000. When we look at men over the age of 65, their rate is very high, 32.51 per 100,000. A few minutes ago, we saw that in the general population, for each death by suicide, it's estimated that there are 25 other attempts. We learned that when we talked about the statistics. However, it's important to note that when an older adult attempts to end their life, those attempts more often result in death. Some of the reasons for this include things as isolation, greater access to lethal means, and the increased likelihood of a serious health condition that would make them less likely to survive a very threatening event. It's also essential and very important to understand that depression is not it's not a natural part of getting older. It's not a natural part of getting older. It's an illness, and left untreated, it can be very fatal. You may be asking yourself, what could contribute to a senior's risk? For individuals older than 65, certain life circumstances can feel like a downpour of stressful events, encouraging that risk of suicide. For example, many of our seniors who live alone have an increased feeling of isolation. They're more likely to have experienced the loss of a partner, close friend, or family member. For many, specifically those living alone, losing a pet can be a significant loss as well. Changes in their health can keep them from doing things that they've always done, leading to a loss of independence and making them more reliant on others. Major role changes, such as retiring, can put an older American at risk, specifically men, who are more likely to define who they are as a person by their professional career. When these life changes and stressors occur, the things that we can do to be supportive can make a very large difference. And again, that's why we're here today, right? Learning about what we can do. Helping that person to stay connected is critical. It's very, very important here. We want to reach out to show that you're thinking of them and that you care. You want to reach out by phone, online, or reach out to them in person. Ask how they are doing, and generally listen. I know that's sometimes hard for us. We need to ask and then listen. We don't have to have all the answers or fix anything. We just need to be there and be there with them. If their health conditions are limiting their ability to do the things that they would normally enjoy, together you can work and discover new interests and hobbies together. Most people who experience these changes will not become suicidal, but those with the risk factors that we mentioned about earlier might. So it's really important that we stay alert about mental health and stay connected. We are going to move on and talk about prevention, what we can do to help our communities and help ourselves stay healthier. But we're actually going to take a quick 15-minute break. I know that this is very heavy material, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. So we will start up again in 15 minutes, which would, if I can see correctly, that would be 10:25. Please, if you have questions, you can come chat with us. There's lots of resources on the table, as well as there is a printout for faith communities as well. So definitely check that out, and we'll get started again at 10:25. Thank you so much.
So how are you?